to speak a bit louder. Uh, and apology for this slight delay. Welcome to all of you. And I can hear a bit of an echo, but I guess we will have to put up with that, like many other technical challenges that we are facing in this hybrid mode. So I'm Rashid Kokap, Executive Director of CUTS International Geneva, and I'm going to moderate this session. Since we are already late by a few minutes, and we will have to conclude the session within an hour strictly. So let me, without further ado, welcome all the participants, a few in the room here in the WTO, and quite a few who are joining us online. As some of you may have discovered yesterday, the technicalities, despite the best efforts of the WTO Secretariat, but organization in this hybrid format has its own challenges. One of the biggest challenges is this lack of interactivity, because apart from the speakers, nobody joining either online or in person in the room would be able to speak. You can put your questions in the question box, and my co-moderator, Julia, who is helping me long distance, will share those questions with the panelists who unfortunately would not be able to see those unless they are simultaneously signed in through another link. A bit complicated, but with your cooperation, I'm sure that we will manage it well. In terms of substance of this session, let me make just three very brief points. First of all, COVID-19 pandemic. This is one of the biggest challenges that humanity has faced in the recent times. The social, economic, health challenges faced by the world, and particularly by developing countries, are immense, because developing countries and LDCs have much lesser resources and capacities. At the same time, secondly, we have also seen the responses, the resilience, the ingenuity of humanity to face this challenge, which is quite heartening. There are valuable lessons, experiences that we are learning at the national level as well as the international. And in that context, my final point, this session aims to bring several key stakeholders to discuss the lessons and experiences of the recent past and the present, with a view to sharing ideas for building better together. We often hear, and which is very sincere, that let's build back better. We argue that building better is not possible without being together. And that fact is the spirit of this session, and is also reflected in the composition of the panels, our panel. I will now move to introduce the panel. We have four excellent speakers. All four of them have rich, impressive, long experience, and it would take another dedicated sessions to do justice to them. So I'll be very brief. Just in 2 sentences, will give the brief background to each of them. Pardeep Mehta is the Secretary General, the founder of CUTS International. He's also the president of the board of CUTS International Geneva. He needs no introduction, prolific writer, speaker, trainer, organizer, activist. He has been an honorary advisor to the Commerce and Industries Minister of India and to the former Director General of the WTO. We also have the honor of having with us today, physically present here while Pardeep is joining remotely from Jaipur, is Her Excellency Mrs. Usha Dwarka Kanabadi. She is currently the permanent representative of the Republic of Mauritius to the UN, WTO, and other international organizations in Geneva. She has worked in diplomatic capacities in Brussels and Geneva. She was High Commissioner of Mauritius to India, and for many years, the Secretary for Foreign Affairs of Mauritius, an impressive diplomatic career. And currently, she's also the coordinator of the African group in the WTO. So thank you, Madam Kanabadi, for joining us. Our third speaker is Elizabeth Turk, who is also the co-organizer for this joint event, with which we are doing in coordination with the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe. She is director of the Economic Cooperation and Trade Division at UNECE. Before that, she acted as chief of the section on international investment agreements in UNCTAD's division on investment enterprises. Her earlier professional activities included in the UNCTAD's division on international and commodities, as well as in the NGO, the Center for International Environmental Law. Finally, our fourth speaker, Mr. Kore Johad, is a seconded national expert to the Directorate General for International Partnerships, DG-INTPA, in the European Commission, specializing on aid for trade, trade and sustainable development, and sustainable value chains. Before taking this position, and that's where I came to know him first, he was the acting head of the unit for policy support at the Swedish International Development Cooperation Agency, SIDA, as well as senior policy specialist for trade there. So as I said, we have a rich galaxy of distinguished panelists. The way I want to run this short session is, to the extent possible, interactively. So I will be posing questions in 2 rounds to each of the panelists, and I'll request them to limit their answers to about 4 minutes to each question. In the meanwhile, if we receive questions from the participants through another platform, my colleague Julian Grolier will be bringing it to their attention through their WhatsApp messages. So he just created that group. So I will request all 4 of you, Ambassador, Pradeep, Elizabeth, and Kore, so kindly keep your mobile on silent, but screen open, so that the questions which I'm afraid you would not be able to see, he can be pointing out to you. So let's face and accept this challenge as well with a smile. And so Pradeep, my first question is going to be to you. Not that you are my boss and I want to put you in any awkward position, but given your vast experience across many fields and looking at the recent past, what are the main challenges for developing countries posed by the pandemic, and equally importantly, the pandemic response measures we have seen being taken at various national and international levels? So Pradeep, you have
Thank you,
about
Rashid.
4 minutes.
Well, I start off at 10 minutes past the hour, which is 10:40, and I hope what I have to say does not sound like a boxing commentary because you asked us to speak in 4 minutes. The point is taken. If we have to have a good discussion, we have to keep it very short and tight. And therefore, my first submission is that this is an unprecedented situation in human history. And therefore, solutions to that are also as uncertain as they are now. I mean, of course, the global community is making all efforts to see to it that solutions are found. At the moment, they're struggling with vaccines, for example. That itself is a very major issue. Now, what we have seen is when you said developing countries, of course, there has been a severe impact on the developing country economies, and particularly poor countries, which in any way did not have that kind of capacity to withstand shocks. All of them are growing and through various kind of problems. Now, what we have seen is around the world, governments, whether rich or poor, have seen their revenues and budgets shrink due to the pandemic response efforts and the economic downturn. Except for some large economies which are still doing well under this situation, which are basically the 2 large economies, US and China. The rest of even the rich countries are not doing so well, and the developing countries are in a worse situation. At the same time, we're going back to what happened, which is dominant in the 3 decades after World War II, was tax more and spend more. Now, how far is that feasible is something to be seen. But when governments have no choice, the only way they can raise revenue is to tax more in order to deal with the exigencies that they have to face. Well, let me conclude here, Rashid, and before in 3 minutes' time, the need of the hour is a large-scale restructuring, like the Marshall Plan, which is done in post-World War II. Of course, it was restricted to Europe, but what is of current need is how can we have a Marshall Plan for the developing world? And one of the easy ways to finance it is through the Tobin tax, which is something which famous economists had proposed, that to charge a decimal percentage on the financial flows in order to raise the kind of funding which is required for development, which will not impact any company in any major way. With that, let me conclude, and so we can move on, Rashid.
Thank you very much, Pradeep. And I will get back to you in the second round as well. Already some ideas are coming. And you also mentioned that the limited capacities of developing countries, which do not allow them to follow this established practice of tax more and spend more. So we still looking at the lessons and experiences. And now I turn to Her Excellency Ambassador Kanabadi, who's from Africa herself, so and a coordinator of the African group, and having worked in many parts of the developing world. Ambassador, what are the immediate and medium-term needs of developing and least developed countries in this situation, particularly the African countries?
Can you hear me? Sorry. Thanks for inviting me to share some thoughts today. I think if I were to give you a real answer as to what are the immediate needs of both developed and developing, it would be very long indeed. If I were to encapsulate all of this in one word, it would be the word solidarity. This morning, I saw one of our colleagues, the ambassador of Nigeria, had shared with us a clip of the UN Secretary General's intervention at the UNGA. And you know, he said there something that was so striking, that solidarity in action is missing at a time when we need it most. And I think that could not be truer. Now, he exemplified this by an image of vaccines in garbage cans, unused, simply having expired. This was extremely striking when you think that 90% of Africans still have yet to have a first dose. Now, how does this solidarity then express itself? If I were to give a WTO response, I'd say first response of WTO would be the health response. And currently we know Ambassador Walker is working already for MC12 on the response to the pandemic and what the health response would be. But for Africa, central to this is accessibility to vaccines and also the IP waiver for production. I know many people will come and tell us, listen, giving you the IP waiver itself is not sufficient. You need know-how, you need technology transfer, you need specialized medical personnel. Why not do voluntary licensing? I think it's wrong to pitch voluntary licensing against IP waiver. They're two separate issues. First, on voluntary licensing, if anybody can come forward and persuade companies that they should not put any cap on production capacities in countries, and two, that they should allow countries which produce these under voluntary license to export where it is needed, that would help. But I think on the IP waiver itself, this is more than just today. Yes, today, Africa has 1/10 of medical density, or medical personnel density as compared to developed countries. But we cannot just look at today. What is not today will be tomorrow. And to us, that starts with the IP waiver as a first step. So this is something that we're looking at definitely. The second issue that needs to go with this is, of course, we've set up a bank of technology for LDCs under the Istanbul Program of Action. So they need to come forward and play their role as well and help us get the technology that we need and help us get the know-how. When you see developed countries who are producing vaccines today complain about distribution, well, we need to find ways to democratize production processes in the years to come. And we need to democratize this with the support of technology transfer, specialized medical personnel, etc. The second response to me would basically be food security. You know, countries that never used to talk about export restrictions or public stock holding are beginning to do that, including in Africa. Look at Madagascar, I mean, with the food situation there, the drought there, and the impact of this. So we have new public stock holding programs coming up. This will take time, but the current peace clause at WTO doesn't cover all these new programs. So we need to find a way to allow countries to create public stock holding programs that will help them in these circumstances and without distorting trade. I'm clear about this. We have actually said that we're willing to go for more transparency as long as you give us the coverage for public stock holding programs, which are genuinely needed on this one. But food security also goes through diversification, right? And some technology transfer. For example, I share for you the case of Mauritius, where we've had the assistance of IAEA to produce tomatoes that are climate change resistant, heat resistant. I'm sure that some people may not know about this kind of thing, but again, we need to pool knowledge together to be able to help diversification in the best and most effective way on this one. The other thing that struck me was many net food importing developing countries, even in Africa. What's the problem? Freight container shortage. So trade facilitation should be working to address this kind of situation. If you have a freight container shortage, it also means the prices have escalated. And we're being told basically that these prices today, which are being imposed by people who do contracts, these will not go back to pre-COVID levels until 2023. Knowing the way business works, it might never go back to the levels of pre-COVID. So I'm extremely worried about the impact, not only for carriage of essential goods, but also I think for the exports of countries that need revenues to come in. And third, just to give you a short answer, I know it may sound longer term, but digital divide, that building of the digital infrastructure. And it is not sufficient for countries to take policy decisions. In my country, we consider IT infrastructure as a critical infrastructure. So we're willing to put in the money. In Rwanda, I have seen that they have put in such investments that 90% of people have access to the internet. We give out iPads or whatever. The issue is basically we need the world to come together to find ways and means of investing in the digital infrastructure in Africa. People cannot work alone on this. And then we can persuade African countries to also look at this. They're doing it already. But today, only 10 out of 45 African countries can actually afford internet access. You know, it sounds crazy because when you think of mobile penetration in Africa and how high it is, but does anybody ever think how you recharge a mobile? Some people have to walk to the nearest village to do that. You know, so we need investments in IT infrastructure, and that cannot be Africa alone. It's got to be the support that we have around. Thank you, Rashid. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, for sharing perspectives from the point of view of developing countries and particularly Africa. And I would not attempt to summarize at this stage or even later, given the richness of the presentations. But if I could say that three securities come out quite clearly in terms of the recent experience and the lessons learned. And you give the example from Africa, the health security, food security, and trade security. And all these need to be addressed in a way of solidarity. So thank you. Continuing with this first round of questions, I would now turn to Elizabeth Turk, our co-host, and the question. So now we are moving a bit towards some other group of countries. So Elizabeth, what has been the experience of Central Asian countries and transition economies?
Many thanks, Rashid. And let me start by thanking you, Rashid, and Pradeep and Kurt for co-hosting this session with UNECE. It's a great pleasure for me. It's a great pleasure for me also, Rashid, the way you posed the question, because in UNECE, amongst our 56 member states, we have a large number of countries with economies in transition. Countries in Central Asia, Southern Caucasus, Western Balkan, and Eastern Europe. And frequently the focus of the trade and development debate really lies on developing countries, but maybe doesn't tend to give the same amount of attention to transition economies. So I'm particularly pleased that we can have this discussion here today. Now, what did we see in that particular region? We did see that transition economies were really hard hit by the crisis and by the pandemic, mainly also because of the travel and transport restrictions that happened, and that made importing, exporting much more difficult. And Ambassador, you just before referred to the importance of trade facilitation. Many transition economies are landlocked countries, landlocked developing economies. So here really the importance of keeping trade flowing, that was one of the key challenges we saw. We also see that many of the transition economies are relatively undiversified in their structure, so that makes them particularly vulnerable. Let me give you some specific examples. At the very beginning of the crisis, clearly the decreased demand in oil and the commodity prices crash had a deep impact on the region, but we've also seen that soften out a little bit over time. A second concrete example of impact is looking at the services sector. Many of the transition economies, and I think, Ambassador, that would also apply to some of the countries you've spoken for, are very dependent on the services sector and tourism services. So obviously here we also saw a major change and a major crush in the last year and a half. A third very concrete example is remittances. Many of the economies we are talking about are heavily depending on remittances. And again, we've seen remittances not flowing as they used to flow, and that causing real development problems. Last but not least, we've also looked at the importance of FDI. And here, let me cite UNCTAD World Investment Report, where UNCTAD documents that the FDI flows to the region in Southern Eastern Europe and the CIS region has plummeted by more than half. So again, a very severe economic impact. Now, let me close by mentioning one further dimension, which I think matters for many economies in transition and generally developing economies. That's the importance of MSMEs, the micro and small and medium-sized enterprises, and the informal sector. So if we look at the informal sector and the MSMEs, on many other occasions in times of crisis, they have actually maybe acted like a buffer, maybe like a shield and a shelter. But in this particular crisis, with all the social distancing and the related restrictions, we've really seen the informal sector and the MSMEs be very, very hardly hit. And we have looked into that and done some studies and really seen that it's not only the negative effects on their productive capacities, the increase of the debt burdens of many of the MSMEs enterprises, but even real clear impact on the deterioration of the living conditions of these micro and small and medium-sized entrepreneurs. So I would say that also countries with economies in transition have been very hardly hit. And some of the elements that were picked already in terms of the way forward, definitely fostering trade facilitation and maybe combining trade facilitation with digitalization, moving from paper-based trade facilitation to digital trade facilitation could be one way of keeping borders open, keeping trade flowing, and making the recovery more resilient. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth, for co-hosting and for these excellent points. And if I can say the challenges that transition economies that you so eloquently described are probably, as you also refer to, are faced by all developing countries. So, and that often depends on the structure of the trade and economic economies, commodity dependence, remittances dependence, FDI dependence, and the structure of the trade in terms of the services, because we did witness that in this crisis, unlike some previous crises, the certain services sectors have been so badly hit. So thank you for bringing in these points. And in this first round of questions, I now turn to Kore. How has we heard about from the others, from Pradeep to Ambassador to Lizzie also, all these experiences of developing countries. And you are coming now from the EU Partnership Directorate. So how has the development partners responded to the pandemic? How have they helped the developing countries? So we are still on the past and the present, and it would be quite interesting to hear your perspective on that. Kore?
Thank you very much, moderator. I hope you can hear me okay. And Ambassador and both CATS International and UNEC, thank you very much for organizing this session and for allowing me to be part of this distinguished panel of speakers. Essentially, I could echo what has already been said to a large extent. I'll focus a bit on the EU perspective and focus a bit more on the aid for trade experience of what we know so far. But of course, there's no doubt that the impacts on developing countries have been dramatic. We've seen, looking at the EU in particular, developing countries' exports to the EU decreased by a staggering 100 billion euros from 2019 to 2020, which amounts to a 16% decrease. Several mentioned the service sector already, and looking at the tourism specifically, exports of tourism decreased by a staggering 70%, which is of course extremely severe for especially those small island development states that are dependent on tourism. And we see kind of similar staggering figures in terms of the impact on GDP, external indebtedness, especially for the LDCs, and in the long run, unfortunately, also on our efforts to reduce poverty. I think what is reassuring to some extent is that in quantitative terms, the development partners have been relatively fast to step up in the sense of noting from the OECD development assistance community that 2020 was proved to be an all-time high in terms of official development assistance. We've seen several initiatives from multilateral and regional banks in terms of suspending debt service payments and offering support in terms of trade finance, support to stimulus packages and things like that. But the challenges remain, no doubt. Looking specifically at the EU, the pandemic has made it essentially a bit of an extra incentive for us to work in a more coordinated manner between the Commission, between us and member states and European financial institutions. We've tried to work in a more consolidated Team Europe approach, and we're able to mobilize up until now something close to 46 billion euros in additional resources that essentially has been focused on tackling the health emergency, health systems, but also not to forget the socioeconomic impacts of the pandemic. We also will release in a couple of weeks our annual Aid for Trade progress report. I can just highlight one figure so far that we carried out a survey among our member states, delegations in partner countries and EU delegations. And over half of the respondents said that the pandemic had an extreme or considerable effect on the delivery of Aid for Trade. So this impact can essentially be seen in both in terms of mobilizing additional resources and needing changes in existing programs. In countries like Angola, Malawi, Montenegro, we've tried to step up our support to mobilize additional resources to not least support governments in making available finance for micro, small and medium-sized enterprises. And then as mentioned, we've also had a lot of changes within existing programs like our so-called Arise Plus program in Cambodia and Laos PDR, carried out the business impact studies to really identify what are the urgent constraints that especially small businesses face, and what can we do to support them in sort of securing operations, protecting jobs, and finding also new export opportunities and new business opportunities, not least in the online sphere. In Ukraine, another example is that we helped set up 7 so-called COVID-19 business clinics that provided urgent anti-crisis support. So just to wrap up, I think in quantitative terms, the EU and development partners have stepped up reasonably well. Of course, it's not been enough in many cases. There's been also cases where development partners have not acted fast enough or in a sufficiently flexible or adaptive manner corresponding to the local needs. And the challenge of policy coherence still remains, of course, where we've seen Aid for Trade on the one hand, but also the importance of tackling export restrictions, as was mentioned by the ambassador already, not least in terms of food to secure access to food and in some other areas. But I will stop there for now. Thank you, Rashid.
Thank you very much, Kore, for sharing some perspectives from the development partner side, particularly giving example from the EU. And it seems from your excellent points that more resources are needed, which are in some cases being provided. But if I could summarize, we need more and deliver better and faster. This is the challenge that is being faced. And of course, now, let me also say that we have, in addition to the few in this room who braved the COVID-19 related restrictions and still managed to join us. So thank you very much. You can put your questions also, as I said, despite you being present here in person, no possibility of speaking. So you can put your questions on this dashboard. And similarly, about 90 or so participants who have joined us online outside of the room as well, are also encouraged to do that. Our speakers will not be able to see it, but perhaps I will and my co-moderator Julia, and we will bring it to the attention of the distinguished panelists. So already some ideas emerging from Tobin tax, bigger universal Marshall Plan type approach for developing countries, as Pradeep mentioned, the WTO actions that Ambassador mentioned to ensure the food security, trade security, health security of developing countries, and also the trade facilitation issues that both Ambassador and Elizabeth mentioned. Also, Kore, you talking about the additionality need and faster and better delivery, the need to focus on informal sector and MSMEs, and so on and so forth. So we already have certain points. And if I could kind of put them all, we need to look at all of them in that sense of solidarity with which Ambassador had started in her first response, and which is, as I had said, the main point of this, or the unifying point of this session. So keeping that in mind, I turn to you again, and Pradeep, I will again start with you. What should be the key priorities for building back better together? What role can the WTO play in this regard?
Thank you. But
Pradeep?
before we look at what WTO can do, it's been picking up the word which Usha spoke about, which you highlighted in terms of solidarity. What we need is a better understanding of multilateralism, which was imperiled by the past US administration and is still struggling in a kind of an ICU, I would say. Unless we get a multilateralism agenda in our head, which should not only cover trade, but would cover many other things, we would not be able to progress on trade alone. Secondly, the title of your session is talking about resilient trade policy and a resilient multilateral trading system. As I said, what is important is that looking at the WTO as an important global public good, how can we move forward? Now, in terms of vaccines, the issue was raised about the TRIPS waiver. Let me remind the audience of something which happened 20 years ago at the Doha ministerial meeting of the WTO, when the TRIPS and Public Health Declaration was adopted to deal with the AIDS problem, the AIDS medicines problem in the US. So there is a framework which is available to us within the four walls of the WTO to deal with the vaccine issue also. Now, what has been said is vaccines involve about 26 countries and about 80 processes, and therefore it is not just one thing which is covered by IPR, but there's a whole host of issues taken. What is then required is, of course, voluntary licensing was spoken about, may not be the best way, and looking at it in this particular way. There is a provision for compulsory licensing, which is what many countries, including US and India, have used in the past to deal with these kind of things. So, and that is something, let us not forget that these solutions are available. So instead of going around with, with our hands folded that we do this, do that, let us use the tools which are already available within the WTO acquis. Now, trade is going to be an important instrument in building back better. There's no doubt about that. The WTO needs to play its part to ensure predictability and stability in the trading system. So the whole agenda, and I'm glad I've been talking to the WTO DG Ngozi on a few occasions, and I find her quite very clear-headed about where to go. Now, one of the most important things in the WTO is the dispute settlement system, the crown and the jewel. As it stands today, the people who are not familiar with the trade jargon or the trade policy jargon think that the WTO is dead. And we have to get this impression out of people that WTO is not dead, but it is. Now, how do we get the dispute settlement system revived? That is very critical. What I see, in order to gain a kind of better acceptance of WTO, then also we require the WTO to continue with its robust monitoring function through its committees, what we call the so-called middle. These have become more imperative than in the past. That the committee should be able to talk about these issues and put out their views to the public at all. Now, the reliance of global supply chains on China became evident when the pandemic first hit. And by the early 2020, there were major disruptions in the supply chain. So what have been happening is, if you look at the UNCTAD report from 2020, the COVID-19 shock to developing countries, it says that firms have begun to rethink their business models and go in for shortening of supply chains to include fewer links in these chains and increased links that are closer to home. What it does is also gives a great opportunity for countries which can afford to develop many of these intermediate products domestically would be able to do that if you look at the kind of situation that we are in. Therefore, a China plus one strategy of supply chain diversification has also become important in this regard. Let me conclude here, Rashid, to remind ourselves that there are certain root problems, and I would like to stress on them again. And as I said, multilateralism itself is under peril. And without that, we'll not be able to get the kind of support that the WTO deserves, particularly in order to unravel the knots which are there today in order to take it forward. And therefore, how do we focus on that is very critical in order to build a resilient WTO. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pradeep. Let me dramatize your message. The first order of priority should be to bring the WTO out of the ICU, as you put it, and revive it and develop a better, resilient understanding for a resilient multilateral trading system. Ambassador, my second question, final, and you can share also any final thoughts because I'm looking at the time. We may not have any possibility for a third round. What are the expectations of developing countries and LDCs from the WTO, development partners, and other international organizations?
It's interesting listening to Pradeep because he's such an institution on WTO matters, and I was tempted. I wish we could have a session and ask him, but how come we don't have general exception clauses in the TRIPS agreement? What happened to that? I'm sure he can answer that question, and I think most of us know why. But coming back to your response, first, WTO is not in the ICU. WTO is member states, and here I want to commend Dr. Angozi. I think she brought WTO back to the table on important discussions that are happening globally. If you think of it, WTO is at the center rather than WHO on the question of vaccine distribution, vaccine problems, etc. She brought together all the heads of the big pharmas, which was something very, very difficult to do. But nobody can do it alone. WTO cannot do it alone. And I think the biggest thing we've witnessed in this pandemic is absence of coherence between institutions. So coordination, coherence works. I'll give one example. The Borgen report for Borgen program, if anybody knows this, in the WHO, which is looking at digitization and innovation in Africa. And we find that despite the digital divide, 13% of innovations that came during the pandemic came from Africa, mostly from Tunisia and Ghana, but other countries like Rwanda, they've invested so critically. They use robots for vaccines, they use drones for delivery. You know, all these institutions coming together, pooling their information together, and then deciding on the way forward. You mentioned a universal Marshall Plan, but it's a universal action plan on we need to do this for food security, we need to do this for health and vaccines, we need to be able to do this for digital divide, and who does what, rather than replicating. And I think to me, central technology transfer remains at the center, and I'll give you one short example, Rashid, to sum up. There's a lot of unpatented technology lying out there. The SMEs that you mentioned, Elizabeth, which lie out in Central Asia, those women especially who run these SMEs sometimes need that simple unpatented technology. But do you really think the woman who sells peanuts on the road, she really cares about aflatoxin or knows about it or even knows how to get rid of it? So we need institutions like ITC to go and get that from WIPO, work with the WIPO, distill it, make it available in sectors so that in programs like She Trades programs, we can actually make a real technology transfer available to people. Thank you, Rashid, for that, but let's work together, please.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. I'm sure Pradeep will be very happy to talk to you, and I'll be happy to organize that whenever he's in Geneva the next time. Yes, technology is key, and yes, the role of the DGWT that you mentioned, which Pradeep was also referring to. So if I reduce the dramatization a bit, so the WTO is out of the ICU, and let's all work together towards a resilient multilateral trading system. Kore, now your turn, and that one question that I had for you is, what lessons have been learned by the development partners? What can be done to do more and better? You already referred to some of these in your earlier intervention. And let me add to that a question that has come from the participants, which I think would be the best place to answer. Is the EU doing anything to support access to essential goods, such as food, beyond vaccinations, in the light of container shortages and the low priority that developing and transition countries tend to have on shipping routes? Virginia Cram, one of our participants, has asked this question. I imagine you have received it through WhatsApp also from my colleague Julia. So two questions for you, one from me and the other by Virginia. Kore?
Thank you very much, Rashid. I'll do my best to respond to these. Now, this is a really key question. To mention briefly a few things that I think have been already, fortunately, kind of realized by the global communities. Firstly, the importance of trade facilitation that we have talked about already. We've seen a lot of fascinating experiences from around the world of border agencies and governments thinking creatively of how to create green lanes and fast tracking the handling of things like food, personal protective equipment, vaccines, not least. And at the same time, we've had some experiences from various places, not least in sub-Saharan Africa, where the lack of speedy procedures led to a lot of food waste at the border, with the trucks standing still for a very long time. So trade facilitation, I think, has been adequately recognized as playing a key role in the handling and the recovery of the pandemic. Secondly, what has really become a buzzword is resilience. We've talked a lot about before, but I think even more now, fortunately, the importance of strengthening domestic productive capacity, strengthening broad-based economic transformation, to be essentially less vulnerable to world market prices for a particular export commodity, less vulnerable to export restrictions and things like that. And that this kind of ties into the question posed by a participant on what we are doing to sort of secure access to food and other essential products. If I focus again on Africa, we can look at the African Continental Free Trade Area, which I think will play an extremely important role in strengthening regional integration and regional value chains, which will be really important for securing access to food. We're doing a lot in terms of strengthening value chains in the coming years. We're just designing our programming priorities for the next 7-year so-called multi-annual financial framework. And we have a huge focus on infrastructure, identifying strategic corridors for key value chains that are of crucial importance, and working also with the actors like the International Cooperative Alliance, because agricultural cooperatives play a key role in this regard, just to mention an example. So resilience is really a key buzzword. And it really means also going beyond focusing on a particular value chain. My worry is a bit that we have focused on, the discussion has been that a particular value chain has not worked. So what can we do to strengthen it? It risks putting us in a position where when the next crisis hits, another value chain might be the key one. So we need to really sort of have a systems approach to this, looking at the whole ecosystem, drawing a parallel from our health policy experiences. We know that when we had too much focus on sort of preventing the spread of one disease or one virus, we've opened up the door for risks of others. So it's really about strengthening health systems as a whole in those regards, and strengthening the economic systems in parallel. So thirdly, of course, we cannot look at trade policy in an isolated manner. I agree with Mr. Mehta that the new DG of the WTO has been extremely vocal and illustrative of the fact that the trade, climate, food security, and health issues really need to go hand in hand, and it does. And I think this pandemic has been really illustrative of that. So a few lessons that might not have been sufficiently learned, I would say, just to wrap up, is firstly the importance of the service sector. Tourism I touched upon earlier, e-commerce as well, but also sectors like logistics, financial services that are important job creators in themselves, but also unlock a lot of productive capacity in manufacturing. So these will be key moving forward. The global aid for trade community has not really put enough focus on these sectors that receive too little of a proportion in terms of the global aid for trade. Secondly, the way we do aid for trade, I think, has to slightly change as well. You know, the boxer Mike Tyson once said that everyone has a plan until they get punched in the face, and I think this is true for a lot of development cooperation programs, in the sense that in the past, I think we have been a bit too top-down, looking at a particular agreement and what to do in order to sort of implement that agreement. What is really needed is to change the perspective around, have a more of a bottom-up approach, looking at the specific constraints to small businesses, involving all the relevant stakeholders, and then building from there in a kind of flexible and adaptive manner, instead of imposing things from a top-down perspective. So finally, just to wrap up, there's of course been a lot of talk also about the importance of inclusiveness and the green aspects in the recovery of the pandemic, and it's reassuring to see this on a rhetorical level. We really need to move on from the rhetorical level to the nitty-gritty, essentially, and integrate and mainstream across the board in terms of aid for trade. Things like the constraints for small-scale traders, for women traders, and how we can integrate environment, regardless if we're talking about trade policy, capacity building, or building productive capacity. How can we better consider marginalized groups and environmental aspects in the way we carry out aid for trade in that sense? So sorry for being a bit too long, Rashid, but I will leave it there.
Thank you, Kore. I let you continue because this is like also, as I had said to Ambassador, the time to make the final points from your side. So thank you for answering the questions. So yes, what you have described, building on what Pradeep and Ambassador had mentioned earlier, we need an ecosystem approach. We know the linkages that the health systems cannot function without a robust economic system and the social solidarity. So an ecosystem approach is needed. Then, of course, resilience would mean better trade facilitation, digitalization, and of course, strengthening the domestic productive capacity and structural transformation, as the developing countries and LDCs have been asking for, and using strategies like agriculture cooperatives, sectoral emphasis on certain services sectors, and in all of that, making sure that this remains inclusive and green. So you have proposed quite an ambitious blueprint. And that, of course, could clearly mean that when it comes to aid for trade, that needs to be thought through and designed to respond to this exciting and yet formidable challenge. Elizabeth, so you will be the last to respond to the questions. I can see there is a specific question to you by one of the participants, Thomas Watai, and his question is, how can UNECE help in Eastern European and Central Asian countries to build back better after the pandemic? With what instruments, policy recommendations, UNECE can help in the recovery of these regions? And of course, let me enlarge that question a bit with my own. So apart from that, what role, more generally, what role do you think can the international organizations play for resilient recovery and to make progress towards achieving the SDGs? Yeah, and you can make your final remarks as well. And I'll take the last couple of minutes to thank and conclude.
Many thanks, Rashid. So many fascinating and important things have been said, so it's a bit hard to add something here. But to start off with, I'd love to go back to two quotes by UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres from the UNGA, and I really like them, so let me recap them here. First quote, he said that the world is challenged like never before, but the Sustainable Development Goals still offer a roadmap to get back on track. So I think this sustainability and solidarity that you mentioned before, that's really our signpost. Second quote, he talked about our times, and he said, it's a moment for transformation, an era to reunite multilateralism, an age of possibilities. So you can really see that call for multilateralism. And I think that very much bodes well with, we are here today in WTO, the multilateral trading system. And if we combine that with the SDGs, it's a really nice package to think about SDGs and trade multilateralism as one. And that really is, for me, also a little bit of inspiration in the things we do. Now, what do IOs and what did the UN do in the COVID response? Amongst the different agencies, for example, we had a series of so-called COVID response projects financed from our United Nations Development Account, where different agencies came together, UNCTAD, the different regional economic commissions, and we really kind of pooled our efforts and our resources and strength on specific topics. And I'd like to recap two, which have been very much discussed here today. One was in the area of multimodal transport and trade connectivity. So that really was a United Nations response to keeping trade flowing along multimodal value chains. Yeah, so that you combine trade facilitation from a truck, from the road to the ship, to the rail and the plane, and how to help countries become more digitalized and more efficient here. So that was one very concrete UN COVID response, where I'm very pleased that UNECE also is taking a key role here. Second one related to MSMEs, entrepreneurship, and I think that's also an endeavor for all of us to nurture and empower these MSMEs. Now, there was also a question about like what UNECE can do, and bringing that back to multilateralism. UNECE is quite an interesting entity because we do have a strong normative machinery. We do develop recommendations, guidelines, and standards. And now we talked before about WTO and the crown jewel. Our laws, our recommendations and guidelines, they are not legally enforceable hard law, but they can sort of support the international trade rules. They can be that sort of like glue or that type of oil that allows us to implement the multilateral international trade rules. So I do see that UNECE, as with its very specific normative function, can have an important role to play here. To give you an example, we developed recommendations recently about a trade facilitation response in times of pandemic and crisis, and also for this multimodal trade facilitation connectivity. These recommendations, they are adopted by our membership. So they do have some sort of like normative value, and I think that's a very interesting contribution. Now, last but not least, somebody mentioned food here today. And I'd like to recall that today is the International Day of Food Loss and Waste. And also here, for example, UNECE has a code of good practice for how to avoid food loss in fresh food and vegetable international trade. So here again, a normative instrument that helps guide the different economic actors to avoid food loss and waste, but there is much more we can talk about on that specific topic. So indeed, I would say international organizations, UN and multilateralism, a strong role to play, and at UNECE, we are delighted to be part of that joint effort.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth, and for quoting those very encouraging quotes by the Secretary General and bringing in the importance of the SDGs as still the relevant overarching framework and goal for us all. In the next couple of minutes, let me present, I would not even claim, and I hope you would bear with me that yes, it would be impossible to capture this enriching, substantive discussion, viewpoints, pieces of information and experience and suggestions in 2 minutes. my main takeaway, so this I'm doing it at my own personal responsibility. Main takeaway is yes, we need to work towards, particularly for developing countries and LDCs in all parts of the world, including Africa, to ensure their health security, their food security, their economic and trade security, technology transfer, bridging the digital divide that they face, and in an inclusive and green manner. That, of course, would mean adopting an ecosystem approach where all parts of the international governance structure, the regional organizations, as well as the national level stakeholders have an important role to play. That would also mean providing much larger amounts of resources, including through aid for trade, doing it faster, and doing it better with the results and impacts on the ground. And that's where certain approaches will have to be adopted and improved. For example, going for the bottoms up approach, where the problem, challenge, need is addressing that and not being prescriptive from the top. Also means looking at possibly new avenues and new ways of delivering, while also maybe taking some of the older practices like the agriculture cooperatives. So a number of options are there. Many bright minds are working on that. And in that also, finally, the objective would be transformational, taking advantage of this transformational moment, not going back to the times before the pandemic and back to business, but using this opportunity to transform in a positive way and with solidarity, as the speakers mentioned. And the final point in that regard would be, yes, the WTO has a key role to play in all these dimensions. Of course, respecting its mandate, its comparative advantage, revitalizing itself, and remaining at the center in collaboration with these various other partners, but remaining at the center of its mandate to deliver, to respond, and to contribute to these challenges and towards a better world for all. So again, with these few words, let me take this opportunity to thank you all, particularly all the participants, first of all, then of course our excellent speakers who helped us and who made these excellent points despite many technological challenges. So I'm very grateful to them, all of them, Pardeep, Kore, and Elizabeth, who also is our co-host, and then of course Master Kanabadi, who has so much to do these days, and still I kept after her, and she spared time for us. I also want to thank my colleague Julian Goroli, whom you did not see, who is remotely was helping me to moderate, our interpreters, and the public forum team at the WTO Secretariat. So thank you very much all. And with this, we bring the